Hello and welcome to the final video for the Frontenac Linux and Addington Science Fair 2022. Again, we would like to thank our sponsors for making all of this possible. And now it's time for the FLASF Keynote Address from 2022. We had Dr. Teresa Purzner as our keynote speaker this year. We invited her because she's the scientific version of a triple threat, in that she has experience as a medical doctor, a researcher, and an entrepreneur, which is pretty amazing. So Dr. Purzner is a clinician scientist neurosurgeon specializing in neuro-oncology and also general neurosurgery. So she completed her medical doctor training at the University of Toronto and her PhD at Stanford University. So she's actually a doctor twice, which is pretty amazing. Dr. Purzner has an interdisciplinary approach to identifying new drug targets for brain cancer, and also in terms of translating promising new drug targets into human-ready therapeutics. And one of these novel drug targets, which she discovered, is a potential treatment for both brain cancer and skin cancer, and is currently being tested in phase 1 and 2 clinical trials. This work has resulted in Dr. Purzner being named a Canadian Top 40 Under 40 and has also given her numerous awards and international recognition. Dr. Purzner, amazingly enough, is also the co-founder and chief scientific officer of a company called Cerebelly, which is a brain-focused baby food company that is sold in over 4,000 stores across the United States, including Whole Foods, Target, Kroger, and Wegmans. So without further ado, I introduce you to the recording of Teresa's amazing keynote speech from this year.
So I put together some slides, and I've decided to call it From Neurosurgery to Drug Development to Entrepreneurship, How Science Led to It All. And so I give lots of talks all the time, but this is the first time I'm giving this specific talk. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it at the end. So a little bit about me. So I'm a neurosurgeon. My day job is neurosurgery, but I do a few other things. So it really was my neurosurgery residency that led me to go down to Stanford to study early brain development. So it was an experience when I was on the pediatric wards where I noticed that there was a huge gap between what we knew about pediatric brain cancer and the drugs we were giving kids. And I knew the only way that I could fill that gap was going back to the bench. And that's really why I stopped clinical neurosurgery and went down to Stanford to study early brain development. Something interesting about early pediatric brain tumors, unlike adult brain tumors, is that they form for a specific reason. It's a part of the brain grows as it normally should, and then it doesn't stop growing. It just keeps growing, and then you get a brain tumor. And so I thought we have to first understand why it normally stops before we can really give a targeted therapy and stopping it later on. And so that's how I ended up out at Stanford. When I was there, my thesis work went very well. I was able to identify a new drug target for the most common pediatric brain tumor based on this developmental approach. And then it went on to phase 1 and then finally phase 2 clinical trials. And so I really got to go into the world of drug development as well, which is a completely different world from from basic science. It's a lot more like entrepreneurship as well. And so that's how I went from basic science now to drug development, a very translational focus in clinical trial design. When I was there, I had my 3 kids as well. So Alex, Mark, and Adeline. And when I became a mom, it again sort of refocused my scientific interest in that initially I was interested in brain development in the context of disease. Now I became very personally motivated to understand brain development in the context of normal brain development, my children themselves. And that's really how I ended up going into entrepreneurship or brainy baby, or I mean, I should say Cerebelly. We initially called it brainy baby. So Cerebelly, it really addresses one of the 3 key pillars of early brain development. So there's 3 reasons why brain develops the way it does. The first is the environment, how you interact with the child, the toys, the books, etc. The second is genetics, so the 2 parents, and then meiosis, of course. And then the third is nutrition. And of these 3 things, the nutrition part was really neglected by society. And so I did a bunch of research around it, found that there was 16 key nutrients important for early brain development. And of those 16, I could only find 2 or 3 at the grocery store in the baby food aisle. And so that's really what motivated me to start Cerebelly. It's, these 16 nutrients are critical. Early brain growth is a time in your life you never get back. Your brain only really grows in that beginning part. The rest of your body continues to renew forever, but your brain cells are what they are, with the exception of a few small areas of the brain that regenerate constantly. And so I thought, I had to bring the science to people. And the way that I brought the science to people was through the form of baby food, through a form that people are very comfortable with. And so that's how I started sort of pursuing all these different paths in life. None of it was intended. I certainly never thought I'd go into entrepreneurship. I definitely didn't think I'd go into drug development. I was kind of a staunchy scientist that thought as soon as you leave the lab, you've left the purity of science. And so a lot of things happened that I didn't expect and I didn't really even necessarily want, but the science led me that way. And so I thought today, because we only have a little bit of time, I'm going to focus on the top 5 reasons why science made me better at everything else. It's kind of nice to do things in numbers. And I know that in the world of social media, we're used to lists. And so here are my top five reasons. That's my daughter, by the way. And this is, I think it's a beautiful image that Cerebelly put together, showing really that it's the marriage of science and parenthood that created this product. So the first reason, I think this is probably my favorite reason, it's the joys of curiosity and adventure. So as a scientist, what science really is that you notice interesting things and then you explore it. And that the ability to do that as your career, and people pay you to do that, just to explore is phenomenal. And there's very, very few jobs that are like that. And so these questions, I wonder if, or why, or why not, are questions that lead to all types of exciting moments and experiences, both professionally, but also personally. And when you really start to try to answer these questions, they're often hard to answer. And so asking these questions creates creativity, right? You need creativity, you need to think outside the box, but you also need kind of courage and grit to get through the answer. So scientists question not only the world around them, but also themselves. And in that way, I really found that science has left me much more open-minded. It helps protect you a bit against your biases, against not only truth, but also the people around you. And so very often if I feel, my kids sometimes will come and do something, I'll think, I didn't tell you to do that. I told you to do this. That's the initial instinct. But I always stop myself and think, well, maybe there was a reason. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe it's not that they're a bad kid that doesn't listen to me. Maybe they actually had a motivation for doing something differently. And very often, some of the most interesting things I've heard from my children came from me taking a step back and saying, well, why didn't you do what I said? And kids think in the most amazing, unharnessed way. So it's beautiful. So when I think of how this idea affected me, when I think of neurosurgery, I went into neurosurgery because it came from a desire to explore the human mind, neuroscience. And the way that you can do that in actual humans is by being a surgeon. It's the only person that gets to interact directly with the human brain. When I think of going to Stanford and drug development, it's because I questioned my clinical experiences. I saw, why is there this gap between the science and the therapies? And then I asked the question, there wasn't a good answer. And so then I had the courage and the grit to go pursue that answer. So it's, again, this idea of why, why is this the case? And finally, when I think of Cerebelly, again, it came from the question, why? Why is the food so terrible right now? Why don't we, what does my kid need in terms of nutrition and early brain development? Why isn't it in the grocery store? And when I realized there was no good reason, it's because the science hadn't been translated. Again, it's then that sense of adventure and okay, well, I'm going to do this. Let's go on adventure. Let's see what happens. The second big thing is the power of asking a good question. And I can't emphasize how important this is. This is an extremely important skill. That's also a very lucrative skill. So if you can ask a good question, people from every field, whether it's venture capital, entrepreneurship, drug development, medicine, all of them are dying for you to tell them the questions that you've been asking. So a good question, it's not just, is it interesting? It has to be interesting, but also, is it novel? Has someone already had basically this question before? If they haven't had the question before, is it obvious based on things that other people have observed before? Is it feasible? So it's great to have a good question, but if you can't answer it, that question is nothing but, mental enjoyment. And it's fun, but it's not useful. And then finally, is it helpful? It doesn't always have to be directly helpful to humans as a whole. I like to think of questions that help many, many people, but maybe it helps progress the field. But it has to be something that's more than just you. And so again, how does this affect it? So neurosurgery, I find that this idea of the power of asking a good question helps me find the zebras, the unusual diagnoses, and it allows me to translate outliers. So if, again, a patient's acting not the way I thought, you ask the question, why are they acting this way? Can I answer the question in a feasible manner? And if I do answer the question, do I have a good drug to translate? Drug development, again, the rigorous efficiency of knowing what the question is and what you need to answer is so important. Otherwise, your path goes all over the place and it's not financially feasible. And then finally, Cerebelly, again, this idea of asking a good question. I know the science I want to give to parents, but I don't know how parents want me to give it to them. What's the format? Is it a bar? Is it a baby food? Is it a sweet food? Is it a savory food? Again, the ability to ask parents, how do you want me to give you this science? It's just been so critical in figuring out the best way to build a company. Next is the rigor of the scientific method. And this is just so important. I apply the scientific method to everything I do professionally. Again, when it comes to building a company, building a drug, doing anything, I use that idea that I am looking for truth. And in science, this is a huge privilege that not a lot of people get, is that in science, you are in pursuit of truth. And there's a lot of reasons why that is super nice. So the first is that truth, well, also super nice, but also super hard and super humbling and sometimes devastating. So the first thing is that truth doesn't care how much you deserve a good discovery. You can do everything right. You can do all the work, and you might lead to nothing because truth doesn't care that you deserve it. It either is or is not true. It doesn't care if what you're doing makes sense. A lot of people say, well, I worked really hard, but I didn't make complete sense. I deserve an outcome. Truth doesn't care. The cancer doesn't care if you had the best intentions. The cancer only cares to continue growing, right? And so it's very difficult, the pursuit of truth. It's very humbling. It doesn't care about your feelings, your ambitions, your orientation, your race, or your opinion. Truth is what it is. The benefit of that is that it also doesn't care about other people's feelings, ambitions, orientation, race, or opinion, or agenda. And that is really important. As much as it doesn't change for you, it doesn't change for other people's agendas either. And so for that reason, when you pursue truth and you do that very, very, very rigorously, you become an efficient human. You become an efficient human who's also humble because you understand that what you want, you don't get in life. It also means that you're very tenacious, but you're flexible. You're not always stuck on the same idea and no longer able to get away from it because truth has told you your idea is wrong. And so you have to then learn how to pivot. And pivoting is huge. And truth provides structure that, for better or worse, stays the same. I've kind of mentioned that a bit. So if you think of other jobs, let's say politics, business, administration, you're the CEO, you have to take care of large groups of people, you're a leader, you're in finance. In these fields, you're not up against truth, you're up against opinions, people, behavior, desires, ambition, all these different things. And those things change, and they change for no good reason a lot of the time, and your outcome is affected by that. And so unlike in science, where you're always pursuing, you're always trying to find the answer to the same, and that answer is out there. It's a matter of whether or not you can find it. In all these other jobs, you can look for the right solution, you can get it, and then suddenly for no reason, it's no longer the right solution. And so I find that personally very difficult. As hard as the truth is, and forgiving as the truth is, at least it's the same. And again, Cerebelly wasn't made to sell baby food. I didn't build a company to sell food. I built a company to translate science. And because translating science is pure, it's the same. It's a lot easier to build a company that way. And I think it's the reason why we've been just so successful so quickly. And again, open-mindedness, the idea that no matter what you think, you have at the end of the day, there is a truth out there. It's not a matter of opinion. It makes you open-minded. And I think being open-minded makes you better in every facet, whether it's personal or professional. Okay, so the fourth one is another big one. It's being and finding a good collaborator. So key in life. So you'll never be able to accomplish more than the potential of a single person if you can't collaborate with other people. If you can't work with other people, you're limited by you. And I am a very effective person, but I still can only do so much. There's 24 hours in my day, and at least 5 or 6 of them are spent sleeping, right? So big things often require more than one person. Not always. That's not always true. There are some isolated scientists who do huge things almost all on their own, right? But nonetheless, for the great majority of us, we have to work in groups to do things well. So collaboration, when good, is synergistic. You're better than the individuals. But when it's bad, it can kill a project. So not all collaboration is good. You have to be able to find what collaborators make sense, and then together you will flourish. So knowing what a good collaborator is will impact every single facet of the rest of your life, irrespective of your career. So whether I'm hiring an administrator, if I have a colleague, if I'm hiring a nanny, if I have a mentor, if I'm mentoring a student, even your spouse, all these people are, in some sense, your collaborators. A lot of them are much more than that. For example, my husband's much more than a collaborator, but he is also my collaborator, whether it's at home, organizing the house and the children, or if it's at work, we do the same job. So he's especially my collaborator. But at the end of the day, you have to know what makes sense. And a really big lesson that I got in drug development or Cerebelly is that when I'm hiring someone or choosing to pick someone, I don't do it based on just their CV. I'm not going to hire the person who has the most awards or the most accomplishments. I pick them based on how well they will fit into the team, and that whether or not as a team, they'll be able to build something big. And so I think that's really important. Also, when you're thinking about building your CV, think not just about your skills, but also understand when you're interviewing for a job, whether it's in the lab or anywhere else, people aren't just thinking about how great are you, they're thinking, how are you going to fit into this group as a whole? And as being a scientist, again, because it's so hard to find that truth, you understand very quickly how important it is to be and to find a good collaborator. So my fifth and last one is science gives you grit, delayed gratification, and makes you used to failure. And we're all very afraid of failing. For some reason, we live in a world where we try to shelter people from failure. But being comfortable with losing, being comfortable with failure is fundamental for you to be brave. If you're afraid of failing, you're not going to take that brave leap. You're not going to try to do that thing that you might fail at because you're so worried about what happens if it doesn't go right. So science very quickly teaches you that failure is part of success. Really big wins require failure along the way. If you're not failing, you're not learning, you're not growing fast enough. You're being too safe, in my opinion. So science has given me my highest highs, but those high highs are very far apart, and there's a whole lot of failure between them. So accepting delayed gratification, the fact that you're going to go through a lot of difficulty before getting that big win, and then having the grit to weather the storm while waiting for that big win is probably the most important attribute to any successful person. So this was asked at one of the Stanford talks. Some of they're actually Nobel laureates there. They were asked, what do you think is a defining feature of a good graduate student? And the consensus was grit. It was that you have to be smart, you have to do all these things, you have to try hard, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately it's like, can this person make it through and still keep trying with the same intensity? And so grit is just so important, and nothing has taught me it more than science. Neurosurgery has taught me how to weather tremendous periods of no sleep and no eating and discomfort, but mental grit was taught to me by science. Failure is inherent to science because you're up against truth, and often your premises are wrong or incomplete. And so you have the best guess based on the information you have, but a lot of the information can be wrong. So feeling the deep failure of science and being able to pivot towards success is critical to entrepreneurship and provides perspective for clinical work as well. So for neurosurgery, if you don't have grit, then you're not going to survive neurosurgery. It's a prerequisite. And Cerebelly startups are almost as painful as science, not quite, but almost as painful. And in the same way, we had to go through a lot of really scary times before we got to where we are now. I would say startups are also probably almost as rewarding as science. If you're doing something it's a real startup, it's not like you're trying to make new types of spam or like another dating app. You're really trying to do something good for the world. Startups can be really thrilling as well. So those are my 5 points of why science makes everything better. It looks like we have about 10 minutes left. So I was just going to go straight into the questions. Is that good?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. So a few of you gave me questions. Thanks very much. I really like getting questions because it means that someone's listening or someone cares. So what motivated me to specialize in neurooncology and neurosurgery? It was neuroscience. I love neuroscience first and foremost. I don't know why. I think everyone has their own thing. I remember very specifically in high school, the first time I opened a textbook and I started reading about the brain, and there was this little clinical vignette that said a person had a stroke and they lost their second language, but still had their primary language they learned at childhood. I thought, oh my goodness, that is so interesting. And I just never stopped reading about the brain from then. So I love the brain, and neurosurgery allows me to interact with the brain directly. And neurooncology allows me to use my neurosurgical skills and my neuroscience skills to directly help people. I've always just liked helping people. I don't know. I don't think it was taught. In some part, obviously, it was conditioned in me, but I think a lot of it, I just came out as someone who wanted other people to be happy. Why did I start a baby food company? Yeah, so I sort of touched on this. It was mostly because I saw that unmet need. I saw the big gap, again, between the science and the products and what people were interacting with. And so I didn't want to start a baby food company. I actually said no when people asked me to. And it wasn't until I just couldn't sleep at night knowing that all these people were not benefiting from a solution that I had in my hands. And so after a lot of convincing, I founded the company with my older brother, and older brothers are good at convincing little sisters. And so he was the one who, after like months and months, finally convinced me, okay, let's do this. And I'm so glad I have now. What part of the brain does my treatment focus on? So I'm working with medulloblastoma. It's the most common pediatric brain tumor, and it's located in the cerebellum. So kind of like right back here. Cerebellum is a fascinating structure. I won't go into it because I'll talk for an hour about the cerebellum, but actually half of all the neurons of your brain are in this one little region, the cerebellum. It's really, and it has beautiful anatomy, and its development is extremely well understood. And the specific cell type and even the proteins that drive its formation into cancer are extremely well known. And so I focused again on the cerebellum and medulloblastoma, not only because there was a clear need clinically, but also because the basic science was the strongest of any brain tumor. And that's how I ended up, I really just followed the science again. This question is related to my science fair project. Do you know if quantum dots can be used to diagnose brain cancer? Oh, that's a really good question. I would be interested in whoever asked that question. That's an excellent question. That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, so it's not currently, but I could see a world where you could ligate a quantum dot to something like an antibody or something like that, that recognizes early indicators of brain cancer and then would light up that brain tumor or the early signs of the brain tumor. And that's something that I think is so important. Right now, we often diagnose brain tumors once they're symptomatic. That means that they're huge tumors that are really heterogeneous and impossible to cure. But if we had a method of lighting up a tumor before it became so big, it would really, I think, not only, it would give us a chance to cure the cancer. Right now, where GBM is, we can't, glioblastoma is the most common brain tumor of adults. I haven't seen a single therapy that's at all promising for cure. They die 100% mortality within 15 months on average. Some people a little bit longer or shorter. But if we could find it earlier, then that would be huge. And that's a field that people are excited on. I don't think anyone's worked with quantum dots in particular. We tend to use different little indicators, radio opaque ones, little radioactive tracers and stuff like that. But it's a fascinating concept. That's a really interesting question. Have you ever judged a science fair? What projects did you like? I've judged a lot of what I would call like a little bit older science fairs. So a lot of medical students, a lot of residents, even other clinicians, their poster presentations at large, multinational conferences and what have you, but it's all the same thing. You're just a little version of what you're going to have to keep doing the rest of your life if you're in science. And I think the projects I like the most are the ones where you read it, you go, that's interesting. That's it. A lot of them you're like, okay, that's pretty cool. Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I expected the outcome. But when someone really asks a question that you haven't asked before, but you have some experience with, I would think that that's very interesting. So I just had to hop off another talk a bit early to join this talk. And they were talking about pain and how pain cycles with your circadian rhythm, which is fascinating. And that was all cool. But at one point he goes, the yellow crusty stuff you get in your eyes in the morning, those are neutrophils. And the neutrophil expression, it relates to the circadian rhythm. And that's why when you wake up, you get this yellow stuff. And I thought, oh, that's cool, right? Because it's something you didn't know, and it's something that you can relate to very directly. And so I think those are the projects I like the most, the ones that something I've experienced a lot, but I've never thought of in that way before. Also, obviously, things that have a very clear translational potential. So things where like, it's so obvious how it's going to benefit people, and it's so feasible, there's no reason you can't take it to people. I think those are really interesting too. What ingredients do you use in baby food? Oh, that's a good question. So I can't answer that question in full because I don't have enough time, but the brain is not one big gelatinous substance, right? Because a lot of different areas that grow at different times. And you guys actually know this because you think of a baby, it doesn't learn to walk and talk and smile all at the same time. It does things sort of one at a time. And those different behavioral things, they're just a reflection of the fact that different regions of the brain are growing at different times. And so different regions require really specific nutrients, and one region requires completely different nutrients from another. And so what they need depends on where they are in their developmental cycle and what regions are growing. And in general, if you have a little baby sister or brother, what I would say is, if you wanted to keep it really clear, just use vegetables. Vegetables are much better than fruit. Vegetables that are really rich in color. So like dark greens, like kale, dark oranges, like sweet potatoes, blueberries. So things that have really rich colors, try to use a lot of them and as many different colors as you can on the plate. And in general, you'll hit a lot of the nutrients that way. How long are the clinical trials for the drugs you're developing? So my trials should have been about 3 years. We're now probably going to be closer to 5 because of COVID. But a lot of trials, I think you kind of want to wrap them up within 5 years or so, would be a reasonable frame. And then 2 years would be a really, really quick trial. That would be like a slam dunk trial where the signal was just so big that they stopped it prematurely because it was so unambiguous. And then what would you say to motivate students to study in your field? I would say that I have no interest in motivating students to go into my specific field. I have tremendous interest in motivating students to really figure out what field makes most sense to them. So I love my field. I love neuroscience. I love neurosurgery. Entrepreneurship is super fun. But I did them not because anyone told me I should or because anyone convinced me they were so cool. I did them because they're what was most interesting to me at any one stage in my life when I was making these big decisions. And so I really recommend that as well, is really give things a fair chance. You don't know what you're going to love. Go deep. I definitely was not someone who thought I would become a scientist when I grew up. Science was an interesting subject to me, but it wasn't, the most interesting. I loved writing too. I loved art. I loved everything. I love music. But I have always been someone who likes to go on adventures. I like difficult problems. I like going on adventures, and I love not knowing what's going to happen next. And so ultimately what played best to my personality was science, not because I was, a lover. I did do all the science fairs and everything. I did enjoy science my whole life, but I think what really pushed me was the fact that I love exploring questions. I want to know things that are happening around me, and I want to help people by all the efforts that I do. And science really was the interface between all those things. You get to go on adventures, you get to ask interesting questions. And if you ask the right questions and go on the right adventure, someone really benefits from it. And so that's how I ended up going into science. And I really do believe everything else I've done since then has just been the same idea. It's just using the scientific method to my life. What do I want to do now? What makes sense? And that's how I ended up on all these very, very unusual, bizarre paths that I never set out for myself. Yeah. Okay. 12:30.
Great job, Teresa. That was fascinating. Are there any additional questions from the audience? Quick pause. Nope. Okay. Well, thank you, Teresa, for giving that presentation. That was really, really interesting. We're all really thankful that you delivered such insight. That was honestly amazing. And I'd love for you to please stay on the line with me. But for everybody else, that concludes our keynote address. Just a quick closing notes here. Number one, if anyone is interested in publishing their science fair project, please get in touch with me, because we can do so through the Canadian Science Fair Journal. So please let me know about that. And also, if you're interested in learning more about how to go into STEM at university, please check out the Queen's Medical History Museum's Medical Studies Discovery Day. I'll be giving a presentation at that, and anyone can come. So it looks like everybody's waving to you, Teresa. Okay, great. So yeah, thank you very much all for coming. And again, Teresa, if you wouldn't mind staying on, that'd be great. So that's the end of Dr. Purzner's keynote address from FLASF 2020. If you are interested in publishing your science fair project from this year, please reach out to the Canadian Science Fair Journal. We would love to hear from you to publish your work. Also, if you're interested in learning more about how to succeed in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and also health sciences, please check out the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame Discovery Day series in health sciences, which will be happening this May, at which I will be delivering a presentation. So that's all for this year. Please stay curious for FLASF 2023.